Good evening. I'm Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's event. It's also my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Tony and Emmy Award-nominated playwright and director Moisés Kaufman and members of his Tectonic Theater project wrote The Laramie Project, a play about the town of Laramie, Wyoming, after the 1998 murder of Matthew Shepard, a young gay man who was beaten and killed. It opened in Denver in March 2000 and moved to New York 2 months later. Time magazine called it one of the 10 best plays of 2000. It was nominated for the Drama Desk Award for Unique Theater Experience, and it remains one of the most performed plays in America today. I'm very proud to say that we performed the play at the University of Richmond just recently in some productions that were supported by the Jepson School and the Robbins School of Business. Mr. Kaufman directed HBO's film adaptation of the play and received 2 Emmy Award nominations, Best Director and Best Writer, for his efforts. The film was the opening night selection of the 2002 Sundance Film Festival, and it won a special mention for Best First Film at the Berlin Film Festival. He most recently directed The Laramie Project at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, performed in repertory for the first time in New York City with The Laramie Project 10 years later, a follow-up to the original play exploring how Laramie had changed since the murder of Matthew Shepard and how we construct our own histories in response to tragic events. Mr. Kaufman's directing credits include The Heiress with Jessica Chastain, 33 Variations with Jane Fonda, the Pulitzer Prize-nominated play Bengal Tiger at Baghdad Zoo with Robin Williams, and the Pulitzer and Tony Award-winning I Am My Own Wife with Jefferson Mays, all of those on Broadway. Elsewhere, Mr. Kaufman has directed A Common Pursuit, The Nightingale, and an adaptation of Tennessee Williams' One Arm, among many other plays. Mr. Kaufman received an Obie Award and Tony nomination for directing I Am My Own Wife, and a Tony nomination for directing 33 Variations. A Guggenheim Fellow, he has also received 7 writing and directing awards for his work on Gross Indecency, The 3 Trials of Oscar Wilde. He's currently directing The Tallest Tree in the Forest, a one-man show about Paul Robeson, and that will finish its U.S. tour in April in Los Angeles. Mr. Kaufman's appearance here this evening is part of the 2013 and 14 Jepson Leadership Forum. It's also part of the One Book, One Richmond program, and part of the Will WGSS lecture series. We're very pleased that it's co-sponsored by our colleagues in Common Ground and the University of Richmond Department of Theater and Dance. Mr. Kaufman will speak this evening, and then he will open the program up for questions. Please join me in giving Mr. Kaufman a very warm welcome to the University of Richmond.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A few years ago, I was invited to Argentina to their major opera house to give a lecture not unlike this one. El Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires is a beautiful building from the 1800s that is based on 2 other opera houses, the Paris Opera House and the Scala Opera House in Milan. Before I was going to give the lecture, the president of the theater invited me to tour the theater with him. It was truly magnificent. Gigantic columns, gilded ceilings, these very, very elaborate, beautiful woodwork all around the theater. Towards the end of the tour, he brought me down to the orchestra and was telling me about the stage and the different machinery that was available on the stage. But I noticed at the sides of the orchestra where the audience sat, this very elaborate iron grill. I was very very taken with that because a theater that was built in the 1870s, it wouldn't have air conditioning. So I didn't know what those iron grills were for. Was it for ventilation? It really struck me. Most theaters of that era don't have anything there because they're trying to preserve the sound. So I asked the president what those grills, what the grill was there for. And he said that when the theater was built, if you were a widow or a widower who had just lost your spouse, you were not supposed to be seen in public in the streets of Buenos Aires for a year after your spouse died. And so the architects of the theater had built rooms outside of the grills so that the widows and widowers could come and watch the plays and watch the performance without being seen. I've always had this idea that I want to write a play about what happened in that room with all the widows and widowers watching the play, the opera. But what interested me about that, there's something profoundly romantic about the idea that even in times of greatest grief, one needs the arts, one needs the theater, one needs performance to soothe one, to give one solace. And I started thinking about what is it about a culture like the Argentinian culture of that time that believed that art was necessary, even at moments like those. I think that in our talk today, since we're talking about leadership and we're talking about culture, can culture play a leadership role within society? Can the arts play a leadership role within society? And I wanted to start with that because I think that is an example of a community that profoundly believed that not only was it possible, but it was necessary. You see, I was born in Venezuela, in Caracas, Venezuela, into a very Orthodox Jewish community within a very, very Catholic and machista country. And by the time I was around 8 years old, I realized I was gay. So here I was, gay, inside an Orthodox Jewish community, inside a very Catholic and machista country. And then I decided to be an artist, to further depart from the norm. But what was interesting was that growing up, this was the 70s and the 80s. I didn't know anybody else who was gay. I thought I was the only person in the world who was gay. So that when I actually went into the dictionary and found the word gay, I was so relieved. I thought, there must be one other person in the world who is gay because there is a word for it. And I thought it was Mr. Merriam-Webster. I mean, with a name like Marian, you know. But there was a sense of great relief at that. You see, growing up, there were two kinds of people that I never thought I could be. I never thought I could be an artist. I knew that artists existed, and I didn't think I could be one. And after I read the word in the dictionary, I knew that homosexuals existed. But again, I didn't think I could be one. So I spent my life practicing. And I'm happy to report that on both cases, but the thing that was interesting about that was that I quickly realized my father used to take me to synagogue every Saturday. And as you know, Venezuela is a tropical country. And we would wear our suits, our heavy wool suits, and our yarmulkes, and we would walk, several blocks to get to the synagogue. And I remember very vividly walking down the street and having people look at us, right? My father was very, very, very tall, and we were kids, so this image of this very tall man with these children with these weird things on their heads and very heavy wool coats in the middle of a very, very hot morning. And I remember asking my father why they're looking at us. And my father, without missing a beat, as if it was nothing to write home about, he said, "Oh, because we're different." Little did he know that in his discourse, he was giving me the tools later on when I had to come out to him, or when I had to realize that I was gay within this community, that he was giving me the tools to understand that whatever it was that I was, it was different, and that was okay. The thing that you probably have heard before, but the thing that's different about gay people is that as a Jewish person, most Jewish people are born into Jewish families. You don't have to come out to your family about, I'm Jewish, most of the times. You know, if you're African American, you're born into an African American household. You don't have to come out to them. But people in the GLBTQ community, they do have to come out to their families. They have to explain. They have to speak about identity, when that may or may not be something that that family usually talks about. But this idea of the other was something that over the course of time, as we're talking about leadership and as we're talking about the artistic impulse, was something that has served me very, very, very well. When I realized that I was part of a community, but unlike that community, that I belonged to a group, but I was unlike that group, all of a sudden there was a way in which I could observe the group that I belonged to from outside. So this binary focus of being able to witness something from inside and outside at the same time. And it happens to me today when I'm in New York and I'm surrounded by a group of artists. I can step outside and see what that group looks like and behaves like. Same thing when I'm in a group of GLBT community. I can step outside and see what that looks like. When I told my father that I wanted to be in the theater, he was very upset. He was a Holocaust survivor who had arrived in Venezuela without a penny. And after working for many years in little delis and little grocery stores, he finally bought his first grocery store and then bought a supermarket. And he was very much of a self-made man, and I was the oldest child. So I was supposed to take over what he very self-deprecatingly described as the empire. So when I told him I wanted to do theater, we would have fights and over a year of arguments. And one day, in the middle of one of his greatest rages, he said, "Why do you want to be in the theater? The theater is full of prostitutes and homosexuals." And I remember thinking, don't let him see how much that idea excites you. Because there was something about the possibility of living with the other, a possibility of being in this space that was tremendously feared and tremendously cherished, that seemed incredibly appealing for a boy of 17 years old. So I decided to go to New York and went to NYU to study theater. And one of the things that happened, you know, it's interesting, we take these transatlantic journeys, and for years, when people would say, "Why did you move to New York?" By that point, I had been doing theater in Venezuela for about 4 years as an actor. And why didn't I stay in Venezuela and continue to do theater there if that's what I really wanted to do? Well, there are two reasons. The first one is that I realized that I didn't want to be an actor anymore. I wanted to be a writer and director. I wasn't interested in handling one character. I wanted to construct the whole narrative. I wanted to construct the worlds on stage. But the other thing, so I would always say, well, I came to New York because NYU had a really good program where I could continue to do my theatrical exploration. But of course, the other truth is that at the time, I realized that I couldn't be gay in Venezuela. At the time, Venezuela was one of the most homophobic places in the world. The deadly combination of very extreme religious upbringing and very extreme machismo was a very, very bad combination for people who were the other. And so I went to New York and I studied for 4 years at NYU. During the whole time I was directing, and the dean of the theater department was very, very fond of me and my work and was very supportive. And when it got time to graduate, I said, okay, I want to be a writer and director. How do I do this? Where do I get a job? And he said, well, Moisés, you're going to have to start your own theater company because nobody's going to give you a job. I thought, well, I thought you liked my work. And he said, no, I love your work, but the kind of exploration that you're doing is one that nobody's going to pay you to do. And this is what he meant, and I think this is what's important for our conversation. I started doing theater because I was unhappy with the theater that I was seeing. Just the way that many leaders embark on their journey because they're unhappy with the status quo. I was unhappy because so much of the theater that we were seeing was either realistic or naturalistic. Meaning that 90% of the times that you went to the theater, you would see a sofa and a kitchen sink. And to me, I mean, that seems a very valid theatrical language, but it was 90% of what I was seeing in New York, which is supposed to be one of the world capitals of theater. And to me, I think that film and television can do realism and naturalism better. So why is it that while all other art forms have evolved, why is it that we're still stuck in these 19th century forms called realism and naturalism? Now, this question was something that really led me to want to understand when naturalism was born, how did it happen, why did it happen, and why are we stuck there? Therefore, leading me to ask the question, what is it that theater can do that only theater can do, that neither film nor television can do? And to me, that question led me to two things. Number one is realizing that naturalism was born in 1896, the first production of Chekhov's The Seagull at the Moscow Art Theater. And it was a gigantic revolution. Why? Because until that time, the way the Russians understood theater was declamation, right? People would come in and declaim Shakespeare, declaim Marlowe, declaim Russian poets of the period. So what does Stanislavski do? Is at the beginning of the play, he has a woman walk in and sit with her back to the audience. The Moscow audiences went crazy. Nobody had ever done that to them. And then as she was sitting there, we heard in the distance horses' hooves. We heard the wind, we heard a river. All of a sudden, he was creating what we now associate with a real strong film score. But that was a new theatrical vocabulary. So, at that time, may I have the projection, please? During that decade that naturalism was born in Russia, this painting was painted. Sunday in the Isle of La Grande Jatte, right? Now, if you look at this painting, this is Pointillism, which is a version of Impressionism. Since this painting, we've had Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, Dadaism, Futurism, Op art, pop art, postmodernisms. In other words, all of the isms of the 20th century. We have continued to redefine our relationship to the canvas. What can occur on the canvas, and how do we relate to it? So again, the question for me was ignited again, why is it that all the other art forms have evolved, right? So that we would not see something like this in a contemporary art gallery. We go to the theater and basically this is what we're seeing. What's interesting to me is that if you look at this work, Seurat was interested in many things. Number one, there's a scientific point of view to this painting, which is that Seurat, at the time that Seurat painted it, science was making great discoveries in how our eyes work. And what our eyes do is that they take pigments of color and our retina puts them together. So Seurat was looking at how far apart could he paint the points of color and still have the retina come with them together. So he was interested in science. As you can see, in the distance, there is a factory. So he was talking about the difference. There was a social political interest for him between the people on this side of the river having a leisurely time and the people on the factory. In addition to the concerns that we now consider obvious, like composition, color, tension. So to me, what was exciting was, why is it that we are constantly looking for new forms, right? Why is it that we need new forms? And that led to, when the dean of the school said, you better create your own company, I did. I went ahead and I created my own theater company, Tectonic Theater Project. And the purpose of Tectonic Theater Project was to explore these questions. What were the new theatrical vocabularies? What were the new theatrical forms? How can we use the stage in a way that it is not about a kitchen sink and that it is not about a sofa? And a lot of the students that I've taught since then always say to me, Mr. Kaufman, are you suggesting that we should never do Arthur Miller again? And of course, some of Arthur Miller's best work is not realistic. If you look at Death of a Salesman, there's a lot of dreamlike elements in there. But yes, there's a lot of Arthur Miller works that's very realistic and naturalistic. And my complaint about that is not, I think realism and naturalism are exquisitely beautiful forms. I object to them being the only forms because I feel that we're wasting an art form, that theater has its own poetry, and that just the way that painters, since this painting, have decided to do, Andy Warhol's portrait of Elvis, or Damien Hirst Dot, or Robert Rauschenberg, where he was placing different things on the canvas. This kind of rigorous questioning of the art form is something that benefits all of us. And this is going to be the proposal that I hope to explore in the rest of this talk, which is that it's very hard for audiences to really listen to new ideas in old forms. In other words, if I was trying to tell you about what's happening in the Ukraine right now, and I made a painting about the fires in the Ukraine, and I did it in this style, you would have a very hard time relating to it as anything other than a museum piece that was very valid in its time. And obviously the artist had a great deal of concerns. So the question that we started posing in Tectonic Theater Project was how? How do we do that? How do we question what can happen on stage? I'll give you an example. Tom Stoppard, the great British playwright, he says that when he talks about the power of what theater can do, in The Tempest, there is one stage direction that Shakespeare wrote that says, Ariel exits, right? Ariel exits, 2 words. And he said that he saw a production that was outdoors and was in a stage that was in front of a theater. So if I was the audience, here was the stage, and there was a lake. I'm sorry, it was in front of a lake. There was a lake behind it. And behind the lake, there was a forest. So I'm the audience, stage, lake, forest. So it says, Ariel exits. So Ariel, the spirit, Ariel, starts running up stage. And as she goes into the lake, as she's about to go into the lake, you think she's either going to swim or she keeps running on the lake. So the set designer had built these things into the water that Ariel could jump on. But for the audience perspective, she was running on water. And then she got to the forest, and when she lost herself in the trees, from the area where she lost herself, fireworks erupted. So this was Ariel, the spirit, running through water and becoming fire and going up. To me, even as I tell you the story, I get goosebumps. To me, that's the theatricality that my work aspires to. That's the theatricality that I feel it's possible. And to me, as a theater maker, I believe that whenever I do a play, if I only focus on the play that I'm doing at that one moment, whether I'm writing it or directing it, and that's all I worry about, I'm doing the art form a great disservice. I always encourage my students that whenever you do a play or whenever you do whenever you stage a play or whenever you write a play, that you should be asking, how will this forward the art form? But this is not a talk about aesthetics, although aesthetics, as I've said, are very, very, very important, especially now when we live in a world where we can read aesthetics as powerfully as we read content. As you know, there was that age-old conversation between what comes first, form or content. And that has been debated for many, 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 many centuries. And then Samuel Beckett in the 1950s destroyed that conversation by saying, form is content. The moment that he said that, and the moment I read that, something clicked, which is that we are keen observers, and we are able to detect the discourse behind aesthetics. I started the Tectonic Theater Project, and we didn't have a penny. We would offer to clean theaters, and so we would clean theater for a month, and then we would ask them to give us the theater for a month. We would find dilapidated spaces, and we would deal with the contractors and say, we'll take all the debris out of here if you give us 2 months of rehearsal space. And for the first 4 years of the company, we started doing plays by people who, like us, had a question about these new forms. We did a lot of Samuel Beckett, we did a lot of Bertolt Brecht, we did a lot of Sophie Treadwell, we did a lot of new American writers that were dealing with this question of what is theatrical. But those were the hardest times. We were rehearsing in my apartment. I had the apartment that I was living at the time had a living room and a dining room, and the dining room had a folding table. So we would fold the table out, rehearse in the apartment, and then when the rehearsal was over, bring the table in, and we would all eat. When we had our first hit, which was Gross Indecency, The Three Trials of Oscar Wilde, and the company started making some money, one day I got home, and my boyfriend had bought this beautiful, beautiful, thick wooden table for the dining room. And he said, do you like it? I said, it's really a very beautiful table. But how are we going to rehearse? And he said, exactly. He said, the company has money, I want my dining room back. But the thing that was interesting about those times is that we were very strongly devoted to this idea of new works and new ways of creating theater. But in reality, what we were doing was revivals. Mind you, revivals are very daring writers, but still revivals. And it was very hard time. Slowly we started getting a reputation in the downtown art scene about the work that we were doing, and we were very well known between 4th and 14th Street on the west side. And many nights we had less audience members than we had actors on stage. And sometimes we were doing 2-character plays. But the commitment at the time, that happened once. We had a 2-character play and only one person came to see the show. And we did the show. And it was a beautiful performance, and that person was very fortunate. But all of this to say that at some point I thought to myself, if we're really being rigorous about this idea of new forms, it's not enough to do other people's work. I have to write my own text. And that's when I wrote Gross Indecency, The Three Trials of Oscar Wilde. And what drew me to write that play was at the time the Mapplethorpe exhibit. Do you remember the Mapplethorpe exhibit that had a lot of nudity, and the National Endowment of the Arts almost got defunded for it? And it led to this whole entire conversation about censorship and about the arts, and not unlike what we're talking about today, the purpose of the arts and the meaning of the arts. And when I started reading the transcripts of the trial of Oscar Wilde, as a theater maker, I knew of Oscar Wilde. He was the great court jester who made Victorian people laugh at themselves. Right? He's one of his great stories was that he was at a party in Paris, and it was getting very late, and everybody had drunk too much, and a very, very, very tall lady with too much makeup and too much hair and too many jewels came to her and said, Monsieur Wilde, you have to agree that I am the ugliest woman in all of Paris. And Oscar Wilde took one look at her and said, Madam, in the world. That's the Oscar Wilde I knew. The Oscar Wilde who could turn a phrase, who could make anything soar. When I started, and I knew also, of course, that he had been tried for being a homosexual. But when I started reading the transcripts of the trial, I realized that over half of the trial was about the lawyer asking him to defend his books. So literally, in the courthouse, the lawyer would open the picture of Dorian Gray and read to Oscar Wilde from Dorian Gray. Say, Mr. Wilde, you wrote this. So-and-so this boy fell madly in love with Basil Howard. Is that moral or immoral? And it struck me that what was on trial there was the artist as much as the homosexual. That what was posing a threat to Victorian society was the artist as much as the homosexual. And in fact, more than half of the trial was about questioning the morality or immorality of his works. Anyway, I wrote this play, and this was the first play I'd ever written. And to me, again, this question of form, right? What happened to me very quickly was that I realized, when you read the biography of Oscar Wilde, it says, Oscar Wilde said that this is what happened at the trial. And then in my research, I would find the book of the lawyer who defended Oscar Wilde. And the lawyer would say, that's not what happened at the trial. This is what happened at the trial. A completely different version. And then I would read Lord Alfred Douglas' memoir, who was Oscar Wilde's lover. And he said, no, neither of what they're saying is true. This is what happened. In my naivete, I thought that when I was done with the research, I would know who's telling the truth. Of course, when I was done with the research, all I was left was a number of different versions of history. And it hit me that I had to write a play not about what happened, because obviously it was impossible to figure out what happened, but about our impossibility to reconstruct history. So the form that the play took was, when we were in rehearsal, there was always a table in the center, and there were all the books that I've used for research, and I would ask the different actors, can you read Oscar Wilde? Now, can you read that page of Lord Alfred Douglas? Can you read that lawyer? So that I would hear all of the divergent versions of the story. And it hit me that that had to be the form of the play. So sure enough, on stage, there was a table full of books, and whenever a character got up, somebody would quote where it's from. This is what Lord Alfred Douglas said, and Lord Alfred Douglas would stand up. This is what Oscar Wilde said, and Oscar Wilde. So this, at the end of the day, the audience had to decide who was telling the truth and who was not telling the truth. And the audience had to decide what narrative to believe. So as opposed to me as the playwright deciding what the narrative was, I was allowing the audience to make that choice. The play opened in March of 1997, and it did very, very well. It became a very big hit. It played in New York for 2 years, and that year it became one of the most performed plays in America. What, over the course of time, happened was that I started having to direct this play all over. And while I was directing the play in London, a young boy by the name of Matthew Shepard was attacked in Laramie, Wyoming. So can we kill the projection, please? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Laramie Project now. But I want to keep posing the question, what is the leadership role of the arts? Is there a leadership role of the arts? And I think that partially of me interposing my own personal narrative with this is an exercise in trying to understand personal leadership journeys versus these uber questions about, can the arts play a leadership role in society? When Matthew Shepard was murdered, my first reaction was horror, shock. The image of this young boy, the way it had been reported in the media, tied to this fence, hung on that fence for 18 hours in the middle of a cold Wyoming October. But after that initial shock of horror and sadness, and Matthew was still alive, of course, so praying for Matthew, praying for his recovery. What struck me even more in the days that followed was that you couldn't open a newspaper without seeing something about Matthew Shepard. You couldn't turn on the television without seeing an article, a piece about Matthew Shepard, or the radio, or the internet. It was everywhere. It really struck me that it was very quickly becoming an American watershed historical moment. Having just finished working on the play about Oscar Wilde, his trial in 1985 was called the Trial of the Century. That trial in itself was a watershed historical moment. Why? Because the Victorians, in trying to incarcerate the artist and the homosexual, what they didn't realize is that every newspaper in the world spoke of the artist and the homosexual. And many gay men that I met, even in 1997, said that there that they had known gay men, that the first time they saw the word gay in a paper or homosexual was during the trial of Oscar Wilde. So, the more that Victoria tried to silence it, the more they gave him a forum in all the papers around the world. But I was keenly aware of these kind of watershed historical moments where a community or a society goes through something and it changes the society, it changes the community. So what struck me is that in 1997 there were about 1,000, in 2008 there were about 1,000 anti-gay crimes that were committed in America every year. Okay? 1,000 anti-gay hate crimes that were committed every year. And for some reason, this one resonated. This one was the one that we as Americans said, wait a minute, look at what's happening. And my question was, why? Why this one? Why this boy? Why Matthew Shepard? Why not the other 999? And I thought at the time, if I take our theater company to Laramie, and we talk to the people of the town of Laramie, we might be able to create a document, not unlike the transcripts of the trial of Oscar Wilde, a document that captured in words, in language, what the ideological pillars of our culture are. Meaning, I wanted to know how Americans are thinking and feeling, not only about homosexuality or gender identity or sexual orientation, but about violence and about education. The two boys that killed Matthew Shepard were two boys, 21 years old, from that town. You know, it's a town of, at the time it was a town of 26,000 people. Everybody knew everybody. Half of the people we interviewed had babysat one of those two boys. So the idea of taking this theater company to Laramie as a way of exploring what had happened sounded true to me. After all, we're an experimental theater company. And as an experimental theater company, we are profoundly committed to exploring what can happen on the stage. And the only way to explore what can happen on the stage is by exploring how what happens on the stage is made. Right? Because in America, the way that theater is made is almost is predetermined. A playwright goes into a room, and she spends 20 years in that room writing a play. And we all have an image of what that room looks like. Empty vodka bottles and cobwebs. And she comes out with the play, and she gives it to the director. And the director takes the play, goes into a rehearsal room. 3 weeks later, and 1 week of tech, and you have a production. Spoken in those terms, you can see the problem with that form. So one of the questions that we set out to ask in Tectonic Theater Project was, what are there other ways of creating work? Can we, a group of New Yorkers, of bohemians, of artists, some of whom are gay, some of whom are straight, some of whom are Latino, some of whom are white, some of whom are Christian, some of whom are Jewish, this very strange group of people, can we go to Laramie, talk to the people of the town, and from those conversations, create a play? And so we decided to go. And I think one of the most important things about leadership, or two important lessons about leadership. I remember very vividly being on the airplane over there with the 9 members of my company that went there. And I had asked everybody, and, is this a good idea? Everybody got excited. Everybody got everything together. We prepared. And then we're in the airplane, and I had a major panic attack. And I thought to myself, half of this company is gay. And I'm taking them to a town in the middle of nowhere, a town that I know nothing about, where a young boy was just killed because he was gay. What happens if they get hurt? Not only that, what happens if one of them is crossing the street and breaks a leg? I had never done anything of that nature. So I turned to one of the company members and I said, I'm terrified, what happened? He said, don't worry, it's not your fault. And that was exactly what I needed to hear. But this idea that great journeys of discovery depart from A, a place of not knowing, and B, a place of great terror. And I think that terror is something we're all taught to avoid, right? The fight or flight instinct. But I think that one of the most important things in leadership is the knowledge that with any great risk comes great terror. And that we have to find a way of letting that be part of the fuel and not something that stops us. But the other thing that was very interesting to me was that none of us, out of the 10 of us, only 2 of us had conducted interviews before. And to me, there's something very powerful about that. Because when Matthew was killed, the media descended on the town. And the media were trained. They were trained to get responses. So they went for the quote, right? They would put a microphone in your face and they would ask you the question that would elicit what they needed. We didn't know that. So what did we do? We would sit with people for 2 hours and ask them questions because we didn't know any better, right? If we had been better at interviewing, the interviews would have been shorter. What happened unbeknownst to us was because of the length of the interview, we created a space for the people of Laramie to hear their thoughts and to speak leisurely about the things that were in their hearts and in their minds about this thing that had happened to them. So again, there's this great, wonderful book called Zen's Mind's Beginner's Mind. If you can run and read it, because it talks about how even when we achieve a certain level of excellence, we must always go back to having that beginner's mind, because that beginner's mind is full of possibility. There is a saying in Russia that if you want to know what a strawberry tastes like, ask a child. To me, there's something about us not knowing and going to Laramie and sitting for 2 hours that really created a kind of magical space where people actually told us. So we spent the better part of a year going back to Laramie and writing this play. And 2 things happened. One is that I discovered why Matthew. And it's a complicated answer. One of the reasons why Matthew Shepard became that watershed historical moment is because it was a crucifixion. The way that the media portrayed Matthew hanging on that fence, with both arms tied to the fence, hanging there for 18 hours, was a crucifixion. And we can't deal with that kind of imagery in this culture without getting an incredible amount of attention. The crucifixion is an image that for many people in this country is full with metaphor, is full with resonance, is full with narrative. So that was one of the reasons, the symbolic nature of the crime. It really made its way directly into people's mythical mind. The other reason is because Matthew Shepard was white, and because he was very, very photogenic. And because he, although he was 21, he looked like he was 14. So we all saw those pictures of Matthew Shepard, and he looked like everybody's kid brother. He was at university. He was starting his life. So he was a very worthy victim in our culture, in a way that an African-American drag queen or an African-American transgender person goes home with somebody, that person ties them to the bed and murders them. That's not a worthy victim in our culture. Matthew Shepard was a worthy victim in our culture. And I think that, to me, that's very, very, very problematic. Why is that a worthy victim and this not a worthy victim? Matthew Shepard also died. Again, if somebody's killed in the commission of a sexual act, all of a sudden we have all this very complex relationship to sex in this culture. So we assign a great deal of blame, and Matthew Shepard was not in that position. So those are another reason that was very silly, was that it was a very, very slow news week. So Matthew Shepard's event really resonated. Had more things been happening in the media, maybe it wouldn't have happened. So all of that are some of the reasons, but there's one reason that I think is worth exploring, which is that in 1998, we were ready as a community and as a society to hear it. We had had over 10 years of the AIDS epidemic. Many people had come out of the closet. We were present in the American psyche. I profoundly believe had Matthew Shepard been murdered exactly the same way 10 years earlier, we would have not heard anything about him because we were not ready as a culture to hear that. So when we talk about art, and we talk about art taking a leadership, we also are forced to talk about imagery, right? And about events of this nature, and how they get represented, and how they get absorbed by culture. We wrote the play, and we opened it in Denver, then we moved to New York, and then I brought it back to the town of Laramie, Wyoming. And when you go to theater school, they always tell you that the purpose of theater is to achieve catharsis, right? Catharsis as this very heightened state, emotional state, where truth becomes clearly visible to all. When was the last time you went to the theater and experienced catharsis? When we went to Laramie and we performed the play for the people of Laramie, I understood what theater is meant to do. You know, theater was made in Greece at a time where the Greeks were trying to test this experiment they were calling democracy. And the stage was used as a platform where they could test these democratic ideals. They had a chorus that was going to symbolize the people, and that they had the individuals. And the relationship between the individuals and the chorus was what they were trying to explore. When we took the play to Laramie, several things happened. As a theater director, I am very used to the sound of an audience. When I go to the theater and I hear an audience, I can hear if the audience is going to be a raucous audience, a quiet audience, a laughing audience, a crying audience. You get very familiar. You can hear before the show starts what kind of an audience you have. And when we performed the play in Laramie, the people entered, and they didn't enter like they were going to a theater. They entered like they were going to church. There was this, I'm not going to call it solemnity, but certainly a certain somberness. You know, we were inviting them to come see the most painful events in their town's history. Not only that, there's 64 characters in the play that are identified by name. So they were coming to hear what of the stuff that they said to us showed up in the play. The lights go down, and the audience stops breathing. My theater company comes out, and all of the actors come out, and I know them very well. They're not breathing either. Everyone in this gigantic theater is terrified for different reasons, but everyone is terrified. And about, I don't know, a minute into the play, there is a line about the Wyoming wind. And this line gets a gigantic laugh because it was the moment of connection. These New Yorkers understood what the wind here feels like. So it got a huge laugh, and then the audience was breathing, and the actors were breathing. And we put a lot of humor in the play. There was a lot of beauty and humor in the play, so that it wasn't bludgeoning the audience. But the thing that I found very, very interesting was that an actor would come up and would say, "My name is Jonah Slonoker." And all of a sudden, a pocket of the theater would crack up in laughter. Why? Because Jonah Slonoker was there, surrounded by his peers. Somebody else would come in another pocket of the theater, another pocket of the theater, another pocket of the theater. What struck us was that in the aftermath of this murder, the people of Laramie had said things to us that they had not said to each other. So when the people of Laramie came to the theater, they were for the first time hearing the deepest effects that this murder had had on the people of Laramie. So there was a communion and there was a catharsis because the people on stage were telling the story to the community, of the community, about this incident that had bruised all of them. So this idea of the theater as a space where this kind of conversation can occur, the most intimate of conversations in the public square, was something that profoundly fascinated me. I'm gonna stop soon, and I'm gonna go into questions because I want to make sure that I give you time to ask questions. But the Laramie Project that year became one of the 10 most performed plays in America, and until today, 13 years later, every year since, it has been one of the 10 most performed plays in America. After that, we wrote a play. We created a play called I Am My Own Wife, and that play, too, became one of the 10 most performed plays in America. So we're the only theater company in America that has 3 of its plays over the last decade made that list. Now, I am really sorry about saying that because the last thing I want to do is sound pompous or self-congratulatory, but this is a leadership conversation. And there is something about the rigorous way in which we have examined theatrical form and the rigorous way in which we have examined how theater can play a role in American culture that bears examining. When President Obama signed the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act into law, he invited Tectonic Theater Project to the White House for the signing of the bill. That's the first time that a theater company has ever been invited to the White House for a signing of a bill. And to me, it was an acknowledgement that the fact that the Laramie Project has been so widely performed and has become part of our cultural lingo, it has had an impact in a national conversation. So to me, when I created Tectonic Theater Project, one of the questions that I posed was, in a time when film and television and the internet are really the places we go to for any kind of national conversation of importance, can the theater play a role in that? Can the theater play a role on a national dialogue about things that matter to us? I think when one goes and sees a movie, one has the experience of the film, whether it's good or bad. If it's good, hopefully you'll talk about it for an hour afterwards with your friends, and then you'll post on it a couple of things, and then it'll become part of our community cultural landscape. The thing that has struck me about theater as a medium is that when the university here does the Laramie Project, or when a high school in Oakland does the Laramie Project, or when a high school in Tennessee does the Laramie Project, that means that the people who are doing the play are invested in this material during 6 to 8 weeks. That means they go to sleep at night thinking about this. They go at the dinner table conversation. They're talking about this with their parents. That means that they've taken the words of the people of Laramie and are speaking those words to the people in their community. So the levels of approximation between those participants and the material is very, very, very intimate. So this idea of, can art play a role? A lot of the times I get asked, Mr. Kaufman, what is it that you want? Do you want, when people come to see your plays, what do you want people to do? And it's an obvious question. A lot of my work is very political, and a lot of my work has a lot of questions about social justice and the social contract under which we live. But the question, the way it's phrased, what do you want people to do when they leave the theater? And I don't believe in agitprop theater, and I don't believe in theater of easy answers. I believe that the great thing about theater is not what it makes you do, but what it makes of you. It's not that it's going to make you go and take to the street with pancards. It's the humanizing and civilizing influence that it can affect you with. So, to conclude, for me, the arts have a humanizing and civilizing influence. They force us to recognize our common humanity. And in doing that, they elevate us. And they make us aspire to our best selves. That's something to aspire to. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Can we have more lights? There you are. Every so often, talking to a very black room, I have these hallucinations. You are much prettier than my hallucinations. All right, so questions, thoughts? Yes, sir. We have mics, so we're going to...
There's so much conversation today about all kinds of sexuality. Do you have an explanation for how this has evolved? I mean, it's everywhere.
How does what?
How does this thing how does this conversation become so significant today? What prompted it? Have you any a theory on that?
Well, I think that there are several reasons, especially in America. I think there's a way of thinking about it as a conversation about sexuality. There's a way of thinking about it as a conversation about social justice. And that we live in a country where we all believe in this social contract that we're all created equal. And therefore we all have the same rights. And I think, and the same responsibilities, of course. And I think that in that context, it's very clear that there's a large group of this nation that is not treated equally. And I think that's what has made this conversation come to the surface. In addition to the fact that I think the AIDS epidemic had a very, very big impact on that. That all of a sudden we could not speak about it. We could no longer be in the closet. Before that, being in the closet was a choice. After AIDS, it was a matter of life and death. So I think that Harvey Milk always said that if everybody came out of the closet, there would be no more homophobia. Because everybody would see that they have a brother or a sister or a son or a parent that is part of the GLBTQ community. So what AIDS did, to a certain extent, was push everybody out of the closet. And all of a sudden, it was impossible to ignore. I have to say that in this question about can the arts lead a conversation in culture and in community and society, I'm 50 years old, and in my lifetime, I have witnessed so much change in relationship to this issue. There is a lot of cause for celebration. If Martin Luther King's statement about the arc of history being very long and tending towards justice is true, I feel proud that I have witnessed some of that. In my lifetime, at least in relationship to GLBTQ ideas, at least in America. Let's be very clear. We're not talking about Russia or Uganda or Arizona. But I have witnessed great progress. I have witnessed within 1 or 2 generations great change. People have changed their minds about something they did a poll a few years back. People over 50 years old, asked them if they were for or against gay marriage. And 60% of people over 50 said that they were against gay marriage. 60%. When they did the same question on people under 50, 60% of people under 50 said that they were for gay marriage. So we are seeing it. When I was teaching today different classes here, I look into the eyes of this generation. They are so powerful. They are so beautiful. They have so much promise. We keep talking about the perils of social media. The social media has created a generation of young people who are so informed and entitled and powerful and beautiful. And I have a great deal of hope for them. Don't disappoint me.
Hi, thank you for coming. I had the opportunity to hear Matthew Shepard's mother speak at a conference in November, and she said that she just recently was able to watch the Laramie Project a few months ago. And I'm wondering, did you have any interaction with her at all in terms of your interviews as you were preparing for the play? And if so, was she able to give any kind of information to you or your troupe?
What's the last part of the question?
If she was able to give any information to you, or if she was able to sort of formulate anything at that moment as you were traveling back and forth throughout that year?
Judy Shepard is a magnificent, magnificent human being. When Matthew was murdered, her entire life she had devoted to her house and her children. She called herself a housewife and a mother, and that was her profession, and that's what she wanted to do. When she found herself in the public eye, her first response was to say, I want to mourn my son, leave me alone. I don't want to talk for any group. I don't want to talk for any cause. I want to be left alone. Very quickly, she realized that she had a window of opportunity in which she could speak to the American people. And she got trained, and she took that platform, and she started speaking. Until this day, she's one of the most powerful allies, one of the most eloquent, one of the most articulate. And she was one of the people who really pushed the hate crime legislation bill forward for 8 years during the entire Bush administration, where nothing was happening, Absolutely nothing was happening. She was out there protesting. She was out there asking for legislation. She was out there at universities, colleges, anywhere they would have her. She was out there telling her story. So I first met her when we were at the trial of the perpetrators. And we said, we're here, we're writing a play. Obviously, we don't want to bother you in any way, but just know that we're here and we're doing this. Right before we opened the play, I sent her a copy of the play. I said, this is what we're doing. Please let me know if there's anything in the play that doesn't ring true or that in any way contradicts what you know. And she wrote back and she said that there was nothing in the play that contradicted anything. When we were going to make the movie for HBO, right before I started shooting, I sent her the screenplay, and again asked her to look it through, and she was fine with it. And then over the course of time, we became friends, but she was never able to watch the movie. She was never able to watch the plays. It was only this last year that she finally was able to come to the theater and sit within an audience and watch it. So, yes, sir, the middle there. I hope I answered your question, yes?
Hi, we're talking about leading through art here, and I think you've talked about how you were able to lead through art by questioning what had come before you, and I think you've led us to an amazing place. Even here, we have classes where we read your plays, and then the point of the class is to write a play like it about our things. And it hasn't been that long, but it does seem like, in a way, you are now what has come before us, and I hope that you don't find this question offensive at all, but...
You're the one, what did you last say? Come before you?
Now you are the one that has come before us.
Oh, yes.
And we are reading
no.
your plays and writing plays.
Yes.
Aping yours.
Yes.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I hope, George Bernard Shaw was reviewing a book, and in his review he said, this is not a book to be tossed away lightly. This is a book that must be thrown out with great force. And I hope that will be my legacy, that you don't toss me away lightly, but you throw me out with great force. That when you do your work, you say, oh, this is the Laramie Project, let's do something completely different. That's the purpose of any artist at any given time. Not only to hopefully revolutionize what came before him or her, but to inspire other people to revolt against her or revolt against them. So the best compliment you can give me is revolting against me. So, but be respectful. I'm kidding. Don't be. You can't revolt and be respectful. That's a contradiction in terms. Yeah. Yes.
That environment looks like? Sorry. What does that look
moment
like?
work is a technique that the company developed in order to pose these questions, right? So this idea that most theater comes from a text, and then you do the text, and then you make a set, and then you make the costumes, and then you rehearse the play. So we wanted to kind of topple that pyramid that was based entirely on the text. And so what we do is we get into the rehearsal room with some ideas, maybe with some tapes of some people's texts, or we create our own text, or we find our own text. And we get into the rehearsal room, and we create based on the elements of the stage. So we do it with lights, or with a piece of costume, or with a piece of scenery, or with a piece of... so that it encourages us to think theatrically. I think one of the great problems of American theater right now is that for a variety of reasons, most professional theaters have a program for new writers, but what they offer new writers are readings of their plays. What does that mean? Actors are called into a room, they sit behind a desk, and they read a play of an author. What we're doing is we're teaching playwrights how to write for readings. We're not teaching playwrights how to write theatrically. We're not teaching playwrights how to write Ariel walking on water and disappearing into fire. So moment work is a technique that hopes to place the moment of creation in the rehearsal room and hopes to place the moment of creation. If you were teaching a painter how to paint, you would not talk to him for 3 hours about painting and then give him 1 hour to paint, right? You would give him a brush and paint, and you would say, here's the canvas, start painting. Or here's the paper. And that's what moment work is saying, we're not going to start with the pre-existing text. We're going to start with learning the language of the stage. And from that language, we can, mind you, in my collaboration with Doug Wright for I Am My Own Wife, we use this technique. It so happens that Doug Wright is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. So the quality of the writing was magnificent, even though we used this method. But I believe that this method, and he has said it himself, opened him up to other narrative possibilities of the stage. And that's what I'm all about. I'm about narrative. I think that I'm interested in telling stories theatrically. And that's kind of the core of my mission. Probably have time for a couple more. Could you expand on that? Can you ask me a specific question? So when I wrote, how many of you know about the story of I Am My Own Wife? Okay, so some of you don't. I Am My Own Wife is a play that Doug Wright wrote about the life of a German transvestite who survived the Nazis and the communists wearing a dress. And it was a real character that he had met and interviewed and talked to, and then he... So when he got to me, when Doug Wright came to me, he had a bunch of tapes, but he didn't have a play. And so I said to him, and what had happened was that he wanted to write this play about this heroine of his, Charlotte von Malsdorf, who had survived all of this in a dress. And as he started writing the play, he realized that, yes, that one of the ways in which she survived was by collaborating with the Stasi, with the Communist Secret Service. So this person that he was hoping to sanctify, canonize, proved to be flawed. And he didn't know how to write a play that would criticize this person he loved so much. So he got a writer's block for about 6 years. And then the people at Sundance said, come work on this play. And he said, but I don't have a play. All I have are tapes and some ideas. They said, get a director that you love and an actor that you love and come up here, get in a room and see if something happens. So I saw my job as taking him to Sundance for 3 weeks and encourage him to not write a play. So we started doing this exercise, moment work. And basically what I said is, okay, forget about the text. Let's use theatrical elements to tell the story of Charlotte von Malsdorf. You know a lot about her. Introduce her to us. I'm going to read. Jefferson Mace is going to read. We're all going to read. And then we're going to present each other theatrical vignettes that use either a set or a prop or a costume to tell the story of Charlotte von Malsdorf. So we started that process. The next day, Charlotte, she didn't look like a woman. She looked like an old Jewish man wearing a dress. And I was always really interested in this idea about gender aesthetics. And I wanted to see what happened. I have a hairy chest. I wanted to see what happened if I put a black dress on with a hairy chest. So I said, this is my moment. And I come in. I said, I'm Charlotte von Malsdorf. And I got undressed to my underwear. And then I put the dress. And then I opened the dress like this. And, I looked at myself in the mirror. Like that. I did that. And that was my moment. Doug Wright brought a moment, which was when the Berlin Wall fell. There were no gay bars allowed in East Berlin. When the Berlin Wall fell, the first thing that Charlotte did was go on a gay bar tour of Berlin to see what gay bars were like. So Doug Wright had this guide, this gay guide to Berlin, and there were all of these names of all of the bars that were at that time open in Berlin. So he says, hi, I'm Charlotte von Malsdorf, and I am going on a gay tour of Berlin. The first place I'm going to go to is, Café Anal. In this bar, there are drag queens and gays, bisexual, S&M, queer night bingo. Yeah. And he read like 6 or 7 things that he did that were bars to kind of try to understand the culture shock that Charlotte von Malsdorf went through. Charlotte also had an incredible collection of furniture. She curated German history by collecting, when the Nazis came and forced the Jews out of their houses and threw the furniture on the street, she would take those pieces of furniture. And she was very crafty with her hands, so she would repair them. And then so she had the collection of furniture that then became her museum, her furniture museum, which still today you can visit in Berlin. And so Jefferson Mays went home that night in Sundance, in the mountains, and he took cardboard and he made, I think, 8 pieces of furniture in cardboard, and he put them in a shoebox. And he said, "Hi, my name is Charlotte von Malsdorf. Welcome to my museum." And he opened the box and he took the sofa. This sofa, yeah, I took from the streets of Berlin right after the war, because Berlin was burning, and I thought, this is a good sofa, it shouldn't burn. And this is a bust of one of our greatest leaders. And I found, she gave us a tour of the entire museum using these pieces that she, all of a sudden, Doug Wright became a child again. He was like, oh, I can do this for 3 weeks. I'm not writing a play. Each one of those 3 moments ended up in the final play. So it is a way of opening up his imagination to theatrical ways in which he could tell the story. So that's what our rehearsal looks like. You come in with an idea, and then you bring in props, and you bring in costumes, and you bring in lights, and you begin to really try to. I believe that the theater has its own language, and that we only use about 10 of the words of that language. And so I'm committed to expanding that vocabulary. On that note, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.